He had bought a forgotten shack deep in the countryside to escape the ache of losing his wife. But when he arrived, he found a young woman inside, homeless, clutching two crying infants in her arms. Can you imagine a man crushed by grief, discovering a desperate mother hiding in the very place he meant to disappear into? It sounds impossible. Yet this story unfolded in rural America more than a century ago. It was the year 1847, in a small settlement near Clayfield, Missouri, a land of wide plains and heavy summers. Back then, the country still carried the raw scars of its frontier days. Farms stretching endlessly, men bent over the earth, women building homes from little more than timber and faith. Life was harsh and families formed early to survive. But not all stories followed the expected road. Some strayed, and in those crooked paths, the strangest fates were born. John Miller was 42 when his world collapsed. He was well known in the county, a respected farmer who had built his land with his own hands. Tall, broad-shouldered, with work-hardened palms and a face carved by years under the sun, John had once carried a quiet confidence. But now his brown eyes were dim, clouded with something words could never reach. His wife, Helen, had been the light of his life. They'd married when he was 23 and she 19. For nearly 2 decades, they had built a world together, one of routine, respect, and devotion. They never had children, something that weighed silently on Helen's heart, though she always said with gentle faith, God writes different stories for everyone. For John, having her was all he'd ever needed, but fever doesn't knock before entering a home. It chooses no side between rich or poor, righteous or lost. In the autumn of 1846, an outbreak swept through the county like a quiet curse. Helen was one of the first to fall. Within 10 days, he watched her burn with fever and drift in delirium, until one gray morning she simply stopped breathing. The burial was simple, just as she would have wanted. Reverend Silas Green led the service at the small wooden chapel in town, and neighbors gathered in silence. John could hardly hear the words. It felt as if part of him had been buried in that plain wooden coffin along with her. The months that followed were hollow. He woke before dawn, worked the fields, tended the animals, returned home after dark. Yet the house no longer felt like a home. Every room held her presence. The kitchen where she baked bread, the garden where she grew herbs, the rocking chair where she mended clothes at sunset. Each memory pressed on him like a stone. He began to avoid the house, sleeping in the barn some nights, wandering the fields others until exhaustion pulled him down. The hired hands whispered among themselves. The boss wasn't right anymore. Some said he'd gone mad with grief. Others, kinder, said time would heal him. But John knew time wouldn't heal anything as long as he stayed there. And so 6 months after Helen's death, in March of 1847, he made a decision that startled everyone. He sold half his land to a neighboring farmer, keeping only what he needed to live modestly. With the money, he bought an old, abandoned shack on the outskirts of Clayfield, about 10 miles away. No one could understand why a man of means would choose a ruin. The shack had been built decades earlier by a traveling trader and left to rot. Its mud and timber walls were cracked, the roof sagged inward, and the place stood alone among tall weeds and oak trees, surrounded by silence. Exactly what John wanted. He told the workers to tend the remaining acres, promised their wages, and left one cold autumn morning with only a few tools, some clothes, and rations packed into a small wagon pulled by a chestnut horse named Thunder. The journey took half a day. The path was rough and scattered with stones, forcing him to climb down several times to guide the wheels over the ruts. By the time the sun dipped low, he finally saw it. The shack, crouched in the clearing, framed by dying light. His chest tightened. It was worse than he remembered. He tied Thunder to a nearby tree, lit an oil lamp, and walked toward the doorway. The wooden door hung by a single hinge, creaking as he pushed it open. The dim yellow light revealed a place long surrendered to decay. A dirt floor scattered with dry leaves, broken furniture in a corner, spiderwebs draped like lace, and the thick scent of mold clinging to the air. John took a few cautious steps inside, raising the lamp. Then, a sound. A faint cry, muffled yet unmistakable. A baby's cry. He froze. His heart slammed in his chest. He turned toward the sound, then came another cry, softer, overlapping the first. 2 babies. Gripping the lamp, John followed the noise to the back of the shack, where a rough wooden divider stood. When he rounded it, he stopped. A young woman was crouched on the floor, clutching 2 infants in her arms, rocking them in desperation. She spun around at the sound of his boots, eyes wide with fear. In the flickering light, he saw a face barely out of girlhood, dirt-streaked, hair tangled, clothes torn to rags. The babies were tiny, their faces red from crying, their cries sharp with hunger. For a long moment, neither spoke. Only their breathing filled the air. Then John found his voice, rough, careful. "Who are you? What are you doing here?" The young woman clutched her children tighter, trembling. Tears welled in her eyes. Not just fear, but despair. "Please." "Sir," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Please. Please don't throw us out. We have nowhere else to go." John took another step forward. The young woman shrank back until her shoulders pressed against the crumbling wall. He raised one hand slowly, a quiet gesture of peace. "It's all right. I'm not going to hurt you," he said. "I just need to understand what's going on here." The girl drew a shaky breath, fighting the sob building in her chest. One of the babies began to cry louder, and she instinctively started rocking him, her movements fragile and exhausted. "My name's Clara," she whispered finally. "Clara Silva. I've been staying here." "About 3 weeks." John looked around in disbelief. "Here, in this place?" She nodded, tears streaking her dirt-covered cheeks. "There was nowhere else. My father threw me out when he found out I was pregnant, said I'd shamed the family, kicked me out with nothing but the clothes on my back, something twisted inside him." He set the lamp on a stone near her and crouched so his eyes were level with hers. "And the baby's father?" he asked quietly. Clara let out a short, bitter laugh. "Gone. Disappeared the day he found out. Don't even know if he's still alive or just ran off to another county. Doesn't matter. He left me alone." The infant's cries rose again. She tried to soothe them, but her hands trembled, part cold, part weakness. "When was the last time you ate?" John asked. She hesitated, ashamed. "Yesterday morning. A lady in town gave me some bread scraps. But I can't go there every day. People talk. They say terrible things." John stayed silent for a long moment. He'd come here to flee the world, to bury his pain in solitude. And now here was a mother and 2 starving infants, living in the ruins he'd chosen as his refuge. What was he supposed to do? Cast her out into the cold in the middle of the night with no food, no roof? He looked at the babies. Twins from the look of them. 1 boy, 1 girl, if their makeshift clothes were any clue. Their tiny fists were clenched tight, faces flushed from crying. And something stirred in him, something he thought had died the day Helen was buried. "Compassion. Wait here," he said, standing up. "Don't leave." "I'll get food." Clara watched him go, a flicker of hope cutting through the fear. "You're not sending us away?" John stopped in the doorway. "Not tonight," he said. "First thing, you all need to eat." He went to the wagon and pulled together what he had: dried beef, a few loaves of bread, a bottle of goat's milk, and a thick wool blanket. When he came back inside and handed them to her, Clara's eyes widened. She laid the babies gently on a few rags she'd been using as bedding and tore into the bread with trembling hands. She ate fast, almost desperately, and it broke something in him to watch it. She had been starving. While she ate, John soaked a clean rag in milk and showed her how to let the babies suck from it. They fed with small, frantic noises until their cries faded to soft breathing. When Clara finally looked up, her eyes shimmered with gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for not turning us out. For giving us food. I don't know how to thank you." John only nodded. He spread the blanket over her and the babies. "Rest. We'll talk in the morning." He stepped outside, gathered a few blankets from the wagon, and laid them beside Thunder. The night was cold, and he lay awake for a long time, staring up at the stars, trying to make sense of what had just happened. He'd come to this place to hide from grief, and now he was sharing it with a stranger and 2 newborns. What would Helen have thought? The question drifted unanswered as he finally fell asleep, worn down by exhaustion and confusion. At dawn, the sound of movement woke him. He rubbed his stiff neck and pushed himself up, every muscle protesting. Sleeping on the ground was no favor to a man his age. He walked to the doorway. Clara was kneeling near the hearth, striking flint over a pile of dry sticks. The baby slept nearby, swaddled in the blanket he'd given her. "Morning," he said, voice rough from sleep. Clara jumped, then relaxed when she saw it was him. "Good morning, sir. I was trying to make a fire, heat some water. Thought you might want coffee. He blinked at her. After everything she'd been through, her first thought was to make him coffee. You can call me John, he said. Sir makes me feel older than I already am. A shy smile tugged at her lips, the first he'd seen from her. Beneath the dirt and weariness, she was a beautiful young woman. I'm Clara, she said softly. But you already know that. They spent the morning working in silence. John examined the shack, figuring out what needed repair first, while Clara helped however she could, gathering branches, sweeping dirt, arranging his few belongings. By noon, as they sat to eat, John finally spoke the words that had been waiting. Clara, I need to be honest with you. I bought this place to be alone, to get away from everything. I wasn't expecting anyone here. Her face fell. I understand. You want us to leave, don't you? He sighed. Maybe I should. It would be the sensible thing. But I can't send you off with 2 infants and nowhere to go. She looked up, a fragile hope lighting her eyes. So here's what I'm thinking, he continued. You can stay, at least for a while. I'll be fixing the place up. It'll take weeks, maybe months. In that time, you take care of the babies, help where you can. I'll make sure there's food and shelter. After that, we'll figure out what's next. Tears welled again, but this time they were tears of relief. I promise I won't be any trouble. I'll cook, I'll clean, I'll keep the babies quiet so they don't bother you. John nodded, trying to stay composed, though something stirred deep inside him. For the first time in months, there was purpose again. Someone needed him, and maybe, just maybe, he needed someone too. The weeks that followed brought an unexpected rhythm to that lonely clearing. John rose early, working through the days, repairing walls, patching the roof, making the shack livable. He rode back to the farm now and then to check on things, while Clara tended to the twins, Michael and Mary, as he learned their names were, gradually transforming the ruin into something that looked almost like a home. She built a small cooking space outside under a tarpaulin he'd brought, cleaned the inside as best she could, washed the baby's clothes in a nearby creek, and every night prepared a modest meal for them both. And little by little, the silence of the place began to sound less like emptiness and more like peace. At first, they barely spoke, eating in silence, each trapped in their own thoughts. But over time, the words began to come. Clara told her story in full. She had grown up in a poor family of small farm laborers. One summer, a traveling trader passed through, a handsome man with easy charm and promises that sounded like poetry. She believed him when he swore he'd return to marry her. Instead, she found herself alone and pregnant. Realizing too late she'd been just one of many, John, in turn, spoke of Helen, how they'd met at a church gathering, how they'd built their farm together, and how sickness had taken her with no mercy. He confessed that the pain still lived inside him like an open wound that refused to close. One cold May evening, while they sat by the fire, Clara asked the question that caught him off guard. Do you still love her? John stirred the embers with a stick, eyes fixed on the small flames dancing in the dark. I'll always love Helen, he said quietly. She was the only woman I ever loved. But love didn't keep her alive, and it doesn't stop the world from turning, no matter how much I wish it would. Clara said nothing for a moment, then softly, my mama used to tell me God never closes a door without opening a window. I never understood that before, but now, living here with you helping us, I think I finally do. John looked up at her, and for the first time noticed how much she'd changed. Her face was no longer hollow or pale. Her dark hair, now clean, fell in soft waves over her shoulders. Her eyes had regained their light. There was strength in her now, quiet but unmistakable. You're a good mother, he said suddenly. Those children are lucky to have you. Clara blushed and looked away. I just do what I can. But they deserve more. They deserve a father, a real home, not this shack in the middle of nowhere. It's not much of a shack anymore, John said with a faint smile. Give me a few more months and it'll be a proper house. But not ours, Clara said softly. It's yours. And when you're done fixing it, you'll want your solitude back. I understand. We made a deal. He didn't answer. That night, lying under the stars while Clara and the children slept inside, he realized something that frightened him. He didn't want to be alone anymore. The months rolled by, and the shack transformed. John replaced the roof, reinforced the walls, built a new door, and even added a wooden partition to make 2 rooms. It was still humble, but it felt safe, solid, alive. Clara planted a small garden beside the house using seeds he'd brought from town. Tomatoes, lettuce, carrots, simple things that brightened their meals. She learned to bake bread too. Each morning, the smell of rising dough filled the air from the little clay oven they'd built together. Michael and Mary grew strong and loud. They could sit up now, babbling nonsense sounds, laughing every time John came near. He'd grown used to their giggles, to lifting them in his arms while Clara cooked dinner, pulling silly faces that made them squeal. It was a simple life. Not the one he'd planned, but one that quietly was healing the wounds Helena had left behind. Then came the Sunday that changed everything. Almost a year had passed since Helen's death. John needed supplies: flour, salt, oil, and a few tools. He usually avoided Sundays, knowing the church square would be crowded after Mass, but this time he had no choice. He rode Thunder into the small town of Clayfield mid-morning. The service had just ended, and people gathered in clusters around the square, chatting, exchanging news, doing what small-town folk always do. John tied the horse near the store and walked toward it, feeling eyes on him, hearing whispers he'd long grown used to. Ever since he'd left the farm, folks had talked. Some said he'd gone mad from grief. Others claimed he was living like a hermit, haunted by his wife's ghost. Let them talk, he'd thought. Words couldn't hurt him anymore. But this time, the rumors had grown teeth. Inside the store stood Mrs. Esme Carter, the town's midwife, short, round, kind when she wanted to be, but with a tongue sharper than a blade. A few weeks earlier, she'd helped deliver a baby on a nearby farm. On her way back, curiosity led her to take the long road past John's property. She'd seen smoke curling from the chimney, baby clothes hanging on a line, and through the cracked window, a young woman cooking while 2 tiny children crawled on the floor. Esme Carter wasted no time. By the next morning, gossip had spread like fire through dry grass. John Miller, the respectable widower, was living in sin with a young woman. There were children, 2 of them. He'd dishonored his late wife's memory before a year had even passed. So when John stepped into the store that day, silence fell sharp and sudden. Mr. Thompson, the shopkeeper, a heavy-set man with a gray mustache, stopped stacking goods and looked at him strangely. "John," he said carefully, "didn't expect to see you today." "I need supplies," John replied, placing a small list on the counter. "Everything's written there." Thompson read the list but didn't move. His eyes flicked toward the door, where Mrs. Carter and several women lingered, pretending not to listen. Then he spoke. "John, I have to ask you something, and I need an honest answer." John frowned. "What question?" "Is it true you're living out there with a young woman? With children?" The blood drained from John's face. How could they know? He'd been careful, kept his distance, avoided town. And if it were true? He said, his voice colder than he meant. Mrs. Carter couldn't resist stepping in. "If it's true, then you ought to be ashamed of yourself, John Miller. Not even a year since poor Helen passed, and you're shacking up with another woman, and with bastards, no less." Anger surged in him like a storm. "Watch your words, Mrs. Carter. Or what?" She shot back. "You'll strike me? Silence me? The whole town knows what you're doing. It's a disgrace!" People began to crowd near the door, some nodding, others only curious for more scandal. John forced himself to breathe slowly, to stay calm. "I owe no explanation to anyone for what happens on my land, but you owe one to God," thundered a voice from the square. Everyone turned. It was Reverend Samuel Green, tall and lean, his dark hair slicked back, his black cassock catching the wind. He strode toward the store, eyes stern, voice heavy with authority. "Reverend," John said, trying to keep his tone respectful. "With all due respect, Reverend, this isn't the church's concern. Everything that touches sin is the church's concern." Reverend Green answered, his voice firm and rising. "And what you're doing, John, is sin. You're living in concubinage, dishonoring your late wife's memory, and setting a poor example for this whole community." "I'm not living in sin," John said through his teeth. "I'm giving shelter to a woman who had nowhere else to go." "A woman?" the Reverend repeated, one eyebrow arched. "A young unmarried woman with 2 illegitimate children, living alone with a widower. And you expect people to believe there's nothing improper in that?" They can believe whatever they like. I know the truth. The truth, thundered the Reverend so the crowd could hear, is that you must send that woman away at once, or marry her before God and make this right. Continuing as you are is unacceptable. John's eyes swept the gathered faces, judgment, curiosity, condemnation. Not one held understanding. Reverend Green, he said quietly but steadily, I've always respected the church, but what I do with my life is between me and my own conscience. He took the list of supplies from the counter, turned, and walked out. The murmurs erupted behind him like a wave, but he didn't look back. He mounted Thunder and rode hard toward home, fury and confusion burning in his chest. By the time he reached the cabin, dusk was falling. Clara sat in the doorway, mending a shirt for Michael. When she saw his face, she stood. What happened? John dismounted, tied the horse, and stood with his back to her for a long moment. Then finally, they know, he said. The whole town knows you're here. Color drained from her face. How? I don't know. Someone must have seen. Now they're saying we're living in sin, that I'm dishonoring Helen's memory. Clara sank down, the cloth falling from her hands. I knew it. I knew this would happen. It always happens. Wherever I go, judgment follows. John turned to her. Clara, no. She stood abruptly, trembling. No, I won't let them drag you through the mud because of me. You have a name here, a life. I won't destroy that. What are you saying? I'm saying I'm leaving tomorrow. I'll take the children and head to St. Louis. It's big enough. No one knows me there. And how will you survive? How will you care for 2 babies alone in a city like that? I don't know, she shouted, her voice breaking. But I'll find a way. I always have. John stepped toward her, but she backed away. Clara, wait. You don't have to do this. Yes, I do. You came here to be alone, to escape your pain. All I've done is bring you more trouble. This is better. She turned and went inside, hurriedly gathering the few belongings she owned. John stood frozen outside, his mind racing. The Reverend had been right about one thing. This couldn't go on. Sooner or later, the rumors would ruin what little remained of his reputation. And Clara would always be branded a concubine. The children, bastards. But the thought of her leaving, of watching her walk away with Michael and Mary into an uncertain future, was unbearable. When had it happened? When had the stranger he'd found in that broken cabin become so vital to him? When had those children, not his by blood, become part of his own heartbeat? And in that moment, John finally faced what he'd been denying for months. He didn't want Clara to go, not out of pity, not out of charity, but because somewhere along the way, he'd begun to feel again, and maybe, just maybe, that wasn't a betrayal of Helen. Maybe it was exactly what Helen would have wanted, for him to live, to love again, to stop mourning the grave. The decision struck him like lightning across a dark sky. He went inside. Clara was tying a bundle of baby clothes, tears wet on her cheeks. Clara, he said, don't try to change my mind. I've decided. So have I. She stopped, confused. Decided what? John drew a slow breath. Marry me. Silence. The world seemed to stop. Clara stared at him, unsure she'd heard right. What? Marry me, he repeated, his voice steadier. If they're going to judge us, let it be for something real. Marry me, Clara. Let me be a father to those children. Let's turn this cabin into a real home. John, are you serious? More serious than I've ever been. She shook her head, tears spilling again. But you don't love me. You still love Helen. I can't be a replacement for someone you lost. John stepped closer, took her hands gently. I'll always love Helen, that's true. But that doesn't mean I can't learn to love again. You've been the light in my darkness, Clara. You and those babies. You brought me back to life. Maybe it's not the same kind of love, but it's real. And it's enough. Clara began to cry again, but this time the tears were different. Soft, trembling, full of something she hadn't felt in years. Hope. Are you sure? She whispered. Because if this is pity, it isn't pity, John said firmly. It's a choice. I'm choosing you. I'm choosing those children. I'm choosing to start over. With a sob, Clara fell into his arms. He held her tightly, feeling both her fragility and her strength. This woman had survived abandonment, hunger, loneliness, and yet she was still standing. Together they could stand stronger. The next morning, John and Clara rode into Clayfield together. No more hiding. John walked straight to the church doors, Clara at his side, the twins in her arms. Reverend Green was in the confessional when John knocked on the sacristy door. When he stepped out and saw them standing there, his brow furrowed. "John, I thought our discussion was finished yesterday. We're here to ask you to marry us," John said without hesitation. The Reverend blinked. "Marry you to her?" "Yes, me and Clara Silva. We want to be married as soon as possible." Reverend Green looked between them, measuring. Clara kept her head high, though she could feel the weight of his judgment. "I see. Well, there are procedures. Banns must be read for 3 Sundays to allow for objections." 3 weeks? John shook his head. "That's too long. The rules are clear, John. Then waive them." "You can do that. It's within your right. Only in exceptional cases." "This is exceptional," John pressed. "The whole town is talking. Every day that passes, Clara's name suffers more." "Marry us now, Reverend." "It's the right thing to do." Reverend Green sighed heavily. The Reverend didn't like breaking protocol. But John was right. Dragging it out for 3 more weeks would only make things worse. "Very well," Reverend Green said at last. "But you'll both have to make a full confession and stand before God declaring that this marriage is real. Not just a way to silence gossip. It's real," John said. Looking at Clara, "Very real." Clara clutched the babies to her chest and nodded. "I swear, Reverend, I'll be a good wife." "I'll honor this man for the rest of my life." The Reverend inclined his head. "Then return next Sunday. I'll perform the ceremony after service." "May God bless this union." The news swept through Clayfield like wildfire. Some were scandalized. Others, especially the older women, wrinkled their noses and muttered that it was shameful. But there were a few who secretly found it touching. A widower giving a second chance to a woman abandoned. A man opening his heart again. Even Mrs. Esme Carter, the midwife who'd once started the rumors, surprised everyone when she said quietly to Mr. Thompson at the store, "Maybe it's for the best." John was drying up inside, and that girl, well, everyone makes mistakes when they're young. At least he's doing the right thing. By Sunday, the little church was packed. Not because people supported it, but because no one wanted to miss the show. A 42-year-old widower marrying a 19-year-old single mother of twins. It would feed gossip for months. John arrived early, wearing the only suit he owned, the same one he'd worn to Helen's funeral. It stung to put it on, but it was all he had. Clara came minutes later, carrying Michael and Mary. She wore a plain white dress she'd sewn herself from cheap fabric, clean and pressed, with a single white flower in her hair. One John had picked for her that morning. There were no guests for Clara. She had no family who'd have her. But John had invited the Hands from his farm. They came out of loyalty, curiosity, maybe both. A few old acquaintances stood in the back, not out of approval, but out of respect. The ceremony was brief. Reverend Green led it solemnly, guiding them through the old vows. When it came time for John to speak, his voice was steady. "I do." Clara echoed him, tears running down her cheeks as she held the restless babies. There were no rings, no celebration, only a quiet church, a few murmured prayers. But when the Reverend finally said, "I now pronounce you husband and wife," and John pressed a gentle kiss to Clara's forehead, something changed. A weight lifted. A new story began. As they stepped out into the sunlight, faces around them were split between reluctant approval and silent judgment. John didn't care. He'd made his choice, and for the first time in a long while, he felt peace. On the ride home, he stopped the wagon atop a small rise overlooking the property. "That place down there," he said, nodding toward the house, "was where I went to die inside. But you turned it into the place where I learned to live again." Clara squeezed his hand. "And you gave me something I thought I'd never have. A family, a home, a name." They drove on as the sun sank behind the hills, painting the sky gold and crimson. The twins slept in her arms, and for the first time in years, John felt something beyond grief. He felt hope. The months that followed brought change. John formally adopted the twins, giving them his name, Michael Miller and Mary Miller, now legitimate children with a father who loved them as his own. Clara adapted easily to being a wife. She ran the household with quiet skill, cooked simple but rich meals, and cared for the children with fierce devotion. But more than that, she filled the house with joy, humming while she worked, laughing at the twins' mischief, softening the hard edges that still guarded John's heart. Their closeness deepened naturally, not sudden, not fiery, but steady like a seed growing in good soil. John began to seek her company not out of duty, but out of need. They'd sit late into the night after the children slept, talking about dreams, fears, and memories. Clara told him things he'd never known. How her mother had died when she was 12. How her father had turned bitter and cruel afterward. How she'd learned to survive on her own. John spoke more of Helen, not to compare but to share, to let Clara know the woman who had shaped the man he'd become. And Clara listened with grace, without jealousy. She understood that loving the past didn't mean he couldn't love the present. Then, one winter night, 4 months after the wedding, everything between them changed. The cold was biting. John had built himself a separate bed in the main room, leaving the larger one for Clara and the children. But that night, Michael was restless, crying with colic. Clara couldn't soothe him. John got up, took the boy in his arms, and paced the room, humming the lullaby his own mother had once sung. Slowly, Michael quieted and drifted to sleep. When John looked up, his eyes met Clara's across the dim room. In that silence, with one child sleeping in his arms and the other in hers, something passed between them. No words were needed. John laid the baby gently beside his sister and reached out his hand. Clara took it and he drew her close. They stood there, wrapped in each other's warmth, hearts beating in the same rhythm. "Clara," he whispered. "Yes? I think I'm falling in love with you." She lifted her face toward him, eyes shining in the lamplight. "Took you long enough to notice," and she kissed him. A soft, trembling kiss, not of convenience or pity, but of promise. Of love. From that night on, they slept together, not as strangers fulfilling a duty, but as true husband and wife. Their intimacy grew quietly, shy at first, then sure, as trust deepened. 3 months later, Clara discovered she was pregnant again. This time, there was no fear, no shame, only joy. When she told John, he lifted her in his arms and spun her around, laughing like a young man. Michael and Mary, now nearly 2, clapped and laughed too, without understanding why, only feeling the happiness in the room. Her pregnancy went smoothly. John treated her as though she were made of glass, refusing to let her do heavy work. He even hired a young girl from town to help with chores, and little by little, the town began to see. The marriage wasn't a scandal. It was real. When the time came, they called Mrs. Carter to assist with the birth. She stepped into the house, no longer a shack, but a true home. New roof, whitewashed walls, glass windows, and a porch where the twins played. "Good Lord, John," she said, amazed. "You've transformed this place." Clara did. He corrected softly. "I just did the heavy lifting. The delivery was quick." Clara was strong, her body knowing exactly what to do. The baby arrived strong, a healthy boy with lungs that filled the room. John was right beside her, gripping her hand. Mrs. Carter, the midwife, cleaned the infant, placed him in Clara's arms, and smiled. "Congratulations," she said. "You've got yourself a beautiful son." John stared at the tiny bundle, his own flesh and blood, then glanced toward the room where Michael and Mary slept. He didn't feel any difference in his heart. They were all his children, every one of them equally loved. "What shall we name him?" he asked softly. Clara looked down at the baby, then up at him. "Gabriel," she said. "Because he's our little angel." John kissed her forehead. "Gabriel Miller." Perfect. The years that followed brought more children. 2 daughters, Helen and Sophia, born in the seasons that came after. The house had to grow with them. New rooms were built, the porch widened. The small patch of earth that had once been a grave of grief now fully alive. John sold what remained of his old farm and poured every dollar into this land, the one he'd once bought as a tomb, for his sorrow but which had become his resurrection. Slowly, the town of Clayfield came to accept the family. There were still whispers about the adopted bastards, about the widow's new life. But most folks saw what was plain to anyone who looked. Michael and Mary were bright, kind, well-mannered children, and John and Clara were living proof that love could grow out of ruin. Even Reverend Green, once so harsh, became a friend. He baptized each of their children and often said their marriage was evidence that God writes straight with crooked lines. Michael and Mary grew up knowing the truth. Clara never hid it, that John wasn't their blood father. but they'd called him Dad since before they could talk. And when they were grown, their loyalty to him was fierce, because they knew he had chosen them when no one else would. Michael became strong and steady, helping John work the land. Mary was studious, always with a book in her lap, dreaming of becoming a school teacher. Gabriel inherited his father's calm, patient nature. Helen had her mother's adventurous spark. And Sophia, the youngest, spoiled by all, carried a golden heart that tied the family together. The house that had once been a decaying shack was now full of life. Laughter, quarrels, singing, tears, and joy. It was noisy, chaotic, imperfect, but it was home. 20 years after the day John had found Clara with 2 babies in her arms, he sat on the front porch of that same house, now 62 years old. His hair had turned silver, his hands roughened by decades of work. Yet his eyes still held a spark. Clara, 39, still beautiful though time had traced fine lines around her eyes, joined him, sitting close. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. John looked out toward the yard where their grandchildren played. Michael had married 2 years earlier and had a son of his own. Mary was engaged to a schoolteacher from a nearby town. "I was thinking about Helen," he said quietly. Clara didn't flinch. She never did when he spoke of his first wife. And what about her? That she'd be happy for us, for you, for all of this. He gestured toward the house, the laughter, the life they'd built. "Helen was a kind woman. She would have loved you. She would have loved these kids." Clara smiled and took his hand, their fingers intertwining. "I like to think she brought us together," she said. "That she was God's last gift to you, a second chance." John turned to look at her, really look. He saw not only the woman beside him now, but the frightened girl he'd found in that broken cabin all those years ago, the desperate mother clutching her twins, the brave wife who had stood against a town's judgment, the partner who had turned his darkness into light. "You know I love you, right?" he said. She smiled, that same smile that still made his heart beat faster. "I know, and you know I love you too." He chuckled softly. "How did we end up here, happy, when it all once felt impossible?" Clara gazed toward the sunset. "I think sometimes God puts people in our path not by accident, but because one of us needs saving. And sometimes when we save someone, we end up saving ourselves too." John squeezed her hand. She was right. He had thought he was rescuing Clara, but she had been the one to rescue him. She had saved a man who'd been dying inside, who'd given up on life, who had bought a ruined cabin to disappear, and turned that ruin into a home, and that man into something living again. They sat together on the porch, hand in hand, watching the sun melt into gold and crimson as children's laughter carried across the yard. And John thought, maybe this was what happiness truly meant. Not perfection, not the absence of pain, but this, building something good out of the ashes, choosing to love again, even with a broken heart, opening the door when fate knocks, not knowing what waits on the other side. It was a ruined cabin that became a home, a hopeless woman who became a wife and mother, a grieving widower who learned to live again. It was life, plain, imperfect, beautiful life, and that was the story of John and Clara Miller, 2 broken hearts that found each other in the unlikeliest of places. Was it destiny or simple chance? Maybe that doesn't matter, because sometimes the miracle isn't in how the story begins, but in how it learns to begin again,